Hey, wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 50. It's our 50th episode. I've been documenting the whole journey on this YouTube channel, but we've done 50 straight episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk now. For those of you that are new to the channel, welcome. My name is Simon Dixon. I've been obsessing over this topic for 2 decades, Bitcoin investing in money, and today we're going to go through everything that happened this week in Bitcoin investing and money. And we are going to unwind the crazy interconnected world that is falling upon us that we get to see with Tether, Celsius, and the US foreign Bitcoin reserve or strategic reserve asset. We're going to be digging into all of it today and trying to help you understand it. Alongside all of this week's news, we had a load of stuff. It was a fairly quiet week in Bitcoin, and then it got very crazy towards the end. The macro side, people are trying to figure out what is going to be happening after Black Monday and the unwinding of the Japanese carry trade. And is it even unwound? We're going to dig deep into that in the macro side. And then we're going to catch up on the geopolitical side and everything that's happening. And if you didn't catch episode 49 earlier, where I did an interview with a good friend of mine on how the Middle Eastern conflict will impact all of the different financial markets. If you haven't figured out the impact that that will have on the markets yet, then I strongly suggest you go back to Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 49 and dive right into that after we go through this week in Bitcoin macro and geopolitics. So let's get started. Well, where are we right now? So we've had catastrophe after catastrophe, and yet Bitcoin has given us an opportunity to buy it again, slightly under $60,000. I bought the dip again, as I always do every month. My commitment is to have more Bitcoin each month than I did the previous month, ever since 2011. And hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, hopefully over the years, have followed suit and are free from the oppression of central banks and are able to have the headspace to think around how to navigate this crazy world. So we've got the Mt. Gox coins. They're distributed. They're done. That was one we're meant to be worried about. GBTC, the digital currency group Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, that one's done. Everyone that wants to sell it and switch over to another ETF, that one's gone. Genesis, that bankruptcy, that's all done now. That's all been distributed. And Celsius was done. And just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. And we're back in with the Celsius bankruptcy, as I will be covering. If you are a Celsius creditor and an Ionic Digital shareholder, you're going to need to do some activist work. You thought you were out. There's a bit more for you to do, but don't worry. I got your back as usual. I'll be coordinating some decisive action, and I've launched a new landing page, which I'll share with you tonight so that you can make sure that you get the most out of the never-ending Celsius saga and story. BlockFi done. They magically found a bunch of money from FTX, and they'll be distributing. Germany, they've sold all their Bitcoin. They're out. But what about the US? The US is in process, but we do not know whether they're going to hold or whether they're going to sell. That is also the story that is also shaping a big chunk of the Bitcoin vote and the crypto vote. The US government sent this week another 10,000 Silk Road Bitcoin over to their Coinbase account. Now, if you dig into the contract, it says that they'll be working a sell order of up to 500, and maybe they're holding them in custody. We still don't know. But the market corrected, and many people are speculating that the correction in the market, while it could have been so many different things, as is always the case, the market moves short term and you find a reason because the economics of Bitcoin just don't change in terms of its supply-demand economics. But those Bitcoin were worth, about 593 million Bitcoin. So they've gone over to Coinbase. And we are now deciding, is Harris going to go the same direction that RFK went and that Trump went and become and use Bitcoin and crypto as a political issue? Well, today we find out on Harris's economic plan, and I haven't watched it. Whether anything's been announced right now, I'll make sure that it makes our way into the episode next week. But will she cover crypto? We shall see. Because here's the cold hard reality. The Bitcoin strategic reserve asset is very, very important for the future of the US economy if you believe and understand where Bitcoin is going next. The 4-year cycle has so far prevailed. We're not sure whether it's going to prevail again. We have all sorts of turmoil that we'll cover in the macro and geopolitical section, but the maths on the code just simply doesn't change. And so, Harris, are you going to prove yourself that you, with the Biden administration, do care about America's right or Americans' right to own their own Bitcoin, to spend their own money, and to support the industry? Because the Biden administration was a disaster for our industry. They did the worst of both worlds. They attacked our industry and they got loads of people scammed because they didn't even protect them. So billions of dollars was taken out from fraudsters that did not know the regulatory environment because of the lack of clarity. And so you scared the business away, and you managed to get them scammed as well by not having a clear regulatory regime. So Harris, show us. Don't just talk about it. The advantage that you have right now is that you can do stuff with the Biden administration and show that you care about Americans' rights, constitutional rights to own their own property, and the financial freedom and freedom from inflation and from the Fed that you could give to American people by adding a little bit more clarity around it. But no, what did she do instead? Well, she decided to enlist 2 anti-crypto advisors to the team with ties to Elizabeth Warren. As Trump says, the cronies around Elizabeth Warren that are trying to use all the money from the bank lobby group in order to make sure that this industry is connected with all the awful things in the world that obviously the dollar can do. People can do it with dollars. They can do it with Bitcoins. But with Bitcoin, you create an immutable record. With dollars, you have to just corrupt the system of banking, and then you can obfuscate those things. With Bitcoin, you create an immutable record. And so, unfortunately, it does not look like that crypto reset that Harris promised in reaction to Trump speaking at Bitcoin 2024 is actually going to do anything. But we must understand, and you must demand, Americans, to know what the Department of Justice is doing with those Bitcoins right now. Because RFK and Trump, I don't know whether they listen to Bitcoin Hard Talk. RFK, every time I see his comments, I'm happy to say it looks like an episode of Bitcoin Hard Talk. Maybe it just goes out into the ether and people spread it all around, but he is saying all the right things. And we manifested into an existence, America wanting to use Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset in order to provide freedom from the Fed. And we will find out whether those Department of Justice tokens get sent over. But there is a couple more plots, as we will cover when we do the whole Tether Celsius scenario. But remember, if not, this week or last week, Russia decided to legalize the mining of Bitcoin. And in October, there is that BRICS conference, and we'll cover a bit more on that on the geopolitical side. And I fully expect China to do the final flip-flop, the final pivot. We've seen it in 2013 when China has had bad Bitcoin policy, but I think it's about to realize that Bitcoin policy is geopolitically and strategically advantageous, even though still about 20% of the mining hash power never left China. But I'm expecting in the not too distant future for China to do the final flip-flop. And we also need to know, what is UK going to do next? UK confiscated some Bitcoin. There was very famously the politician Gordon Brown, who sold all of Bitcoin's gold, all of the UK's gold. Are we going to see the same happen under Keir Starmer, with UK's Bitcoin. We shall see. So let's jump into the story, the main story of this week. Anyway, so it came out, it hit the docket that Tether is being sued by the Celsius estate. Now, we knew this was always going to happen because there are some rules in bankruptcy where if you start withdrawing funds and that harms other creditors, because those creditors that were left that didn't withdraw, they end up, those that got made whole, and Tether did get made whole, they didn't suffer financial loss, but they ended up with about 57,000 of creditors' Bitcoin that Maszynski scammed, and then they sold them, locking in the loss at the bottom of the market. And the allegation is that it was done at a loss to creditors as well. So when you total up all of the Bitcoins, client Bitcoins that were stolen from them, that was used in order to borrow and end up with a whole load of Dudley Moore mining equipment, that now we're having to engage in the next scam and turn around for Celsius creditors because it bought a load of mining equipment that was then given to by a bunch of corrupt lawyers to give their mates a job and try and make a company public that still is not public. And we have a board that is just using it as their personal piggy bank in order to victimize the victims of the Maszynski scam in a triple whammy again. But we're going to have to do some activist action in order to not allow these perpetrators to get away with it. But anyway, on the Tether side, 57,000 Bitcoin were held as collateral. And over time, about $2 billion in Tether was borrowed against it. Now, if there is any kind of deep discovery before a settlement, then it will all be looked at in terms of how were those 2 billion Tethers created? Was it backed by Bitcoin? What happened? We're about to find out with that. But we knew that this was always coming because it led to significant loss for the vast majority of creditors. And so Maszynski took out those $2 billion loans. And the allegation is that those Bitcoin were, they were liquidated and not in lines with the terms and conditions in the agreement. So the agreements were put in there, and it said that there is this 10-hour clause. And obviously Tether, I've been covering it a lot over the years. And Tether is sitting on $12 billion of liquid cash. They're calling this a predatory opportunistic, saying that the Celsius estate is coming after it a couple of years later. But they had a specific order in which they were going to do this. And so the lawsuit is on the docket, and we get to see anything. They're saying that it's a liquidation. But even if it isn't, and they disprove those allegations, there are rules around the bankruptcy code. And so likely it will lead to some kind of settlement. But what else is happening in the background? Well, the Bitcoin was allegedly sold at below market value, at below market prices. They're saying that those were confirmed. But because they happened within the 90 days prior to the bankruptcy, and in fact, during the infamous pause, obviously Maszynski was trying to borrow money to try and fix his Ponzi scheme. But that is the clawback period as well. So the issue is that where are those coins going to be coming from? So Tether has a strategy of buying US Treasury debt, which has now made Tether, interestingly, the 18th largest lender to the US dollar Ponzi scheme. And so it is lending, and then the interest rate that the Federal Reserve has to increase in order to control inflation ends up paying, because the American government is paying now 76% of all its tax income just to servicing debt to its bondholders. And those bondholders, one of them, the 18th largest part, one of them is Tether. And that allows them to buy Bitcoin. So they end up with this large Bitcoin position and $12 billion worth of Bitcoin or mining or various other things that is being contributed to the community. And Tether then comes out and says that it's going to dismiss its lawsuit. It's already got the money to back it up, so it doesn't create any contagion within the industry as it would for another stable coin. But at the same time, Bitfinex, the sister company, you know that in 2016, when the exchange got hacked, Bank to the Future, the company I co-founded, was involved in structuring a way of getting Bitfinex, the exchange, back up and running and compensating shareholders, where they ended up with a token, and that token could have been exchanged for equity in Bitfinex on Bank to the Future, the company that I co-founded. And it became one of the most successful bankruptcies and ways of recovering without having to have all the lawyers and scamming process, which ends up triple scamming you like we have within as Celsius shareholders and creditors. And so the department of those coins were essentially, they belong to shareholders because those creditors exchanged the tokens that they received for shares in Bitfinex. And we run a group of shareholders. And so we know that when they exchange their claim for shares in the company, if those Bitcoins were ever recovered into the future, they go to shareholders. And then Bitfinex made other obligations on those as well. And we know that 119,000 of those Bitcoins were, in fact, found from the crocodile of Wall Street. And we are not 100% sure, but 95,000 of them ended up with the DOJ. And so the Bitcoin that belongs to Bitfinex shareholders, which is a sister company of Tether, has 95,000 of its Bitcoin with the Department of Justice, while Tether has become the largest lender to the US government at the same time as this whole case where Celsius, which is one of the companies that was borrowing from Tether, using client Bitcoin, which it wasn't entitled to use as collateral, ended up getting sold on the Bitfinex exchange as collateral that ended up making a loss. So this led to this lawsuit where the Celsius estate is now suing Tether. And there's just a little bit more to this story if it's not crazy enough. That whole hack recovery solution that we put together happened in 2016. Tether is also a shareholder in Celsius. And so we ended up doing, as you know, I became a creditor because we did a funding round based upon Celsius not actually doing fraudulently, not showing us their financials and giving us financials that did not disclose the hole that they had. And so they're now also, the estate is also coming after a couple of other actors. One of those is Badger DAO. And another one is the Compound Labs. And there's another one called Bancor DAO. But what happened with Badger DAO? So the Celsius estate has all these casualties that came from the Celsius fraud. And it was entrenched in this craziness of taking client Bitcoin, borrowing it to buy Bitcoin mining equipment. And then we had this whole thing that's happening with Tether that's being sued as well. But Badger DAO just got hacked for a bunch of client Bitcoin or ETH or whatever it was in 2021. And who's Badger DAO owned by? Well, Badger DAO is partially owned by family members of the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his relatives. And there was a whole connection between those that didn't go to prison and Majinsky trying to go to prison, who's an ex-IDF soldier from Israel, and all of these assets ending up in Israel. And the people that are now in Israel are not going to prison while Majinsky's facing tough justice in January 2025. And we had assets like GK8, which was a custody solution built in Israel. And we got this whole connection where the company that hacked creditors' funds is also the company that is owned by the relatives of the Prime Minister of Israel. There's something very strange going on that's going to unearth itself. And now what do we need to do? Because all of these mining assets were bought, we end up with all of these mining assets and a bunch of people that were injected into the board because they were all working with the lawyers that got to construct this. And rather than doing what Bank to the Future wanted to do with Bitfinex, distribute everybody's assets for free, they end up charging us insane amounts of money and putting us together with another corrupt bunch of people that it looks like, or the allegation is that they're siphoning off a bunch of this money from Ionic Digital, the company that was set up in order to give to shareholders, the victims of the Celsius fraud, give them access to these assets. It looks like the company that was injected in order to try and save the day, that has now gone public, Hut 8, based upon contracts that happened with Ionic Digital, that received the assets from the Celsius Ponzi, that were received as a loan from client assets that were borrowed against through Tether, who is a shareholder in Celsius, that we are now shareholders and entitled to some of that Bitcoin as a result of the 2016 hack. And now all of this is being disclosed transparently and is brilliant. We get to see everything when all of this stuff was happening shadowy. So speaking of Ionic Digital, which is this new company that it turns out that one of the creditors, Tony V, sent a letter into the court requesting information, that it turns out that all of a sudden they produce this information. The whole board is in disarray. There is no auditor. Suddenly the auditor disappears. Suddenly all of these assets, rather than being plugged in, they're in craziness with 60% downtime. Suddenly we're not getting access to any of the financial data or any of the promises. The company's no longer going public, and we need to overhaul the board in order to drain the damn swamp of the Ionic board that seem to be obfuscating all sorts of craziness, rather than just giving us a Bitcoin mining operation, because they put an incompetent board that has no experience, even though we were ready to distribute all those assets at Bank to the Future and do what we already did, a very fast turnaround at cheap for Bitfinex victims as well. We could have done the same for Celsius victims, but because there's this all crazy lobbying and stuff that happens in the bankruptcy process, we end up with the Dudley Moore team and all the assets and trying to sweep up the mess as well. So with that in mind, if you are an Ionic Digital shareholder, we are going to need 25% of your vote. I'm not going to go into why right now, but I recorded a video and you can go watch that video in order to influence the outcome to drain the Ionic Digital swamp and ensure that the person, Hut 8, that is trying to get hold of all these assets, in my speculation, this is just my belief around what's happening and my speculation, we need to ensure that that does not happen in order to try and boost their share price at the expense of our share price. So in order to do that, please go over to simondixon.com/Ionic Digital. If we can get 25% of the shareholders to complete a form so that I can demonstrate we have it, we have others and different options. And I outlined 3 different options. So I'm not going to go into that. Please head over to simondixon.com/Ionic Digital in order to find out more about that. But what is the thing that blew this whole thing up in the first place? Well, we know that it was because of, firstly, there was a Ponzi scheme and the emperor had no clothes and it was insolvent from day one. And they were using it in order to, I covered in previous episodes, Mijinski wanted to pump Cell token with hard money like Bitcoin to buy shit money like Cell token, and ended up taking $600 million of digital hard sound money and using it in order to pump out and sell and dump Cell token onto the market in what they are being accused of market manipulation and all sorts of shenanigans in the Mijinski case. But what exposed it in the first place? Well, of course, it was when Terra Luna created a cycle of all the other fraudsters. And one of the hedge funds that was massively exposed to Terra Luna, which was a fake central bank created by Do Kwon that was meant to be decentralized. And when Bitcoin started correcting in value, everyone got revealed. And 3 Arrows Capital was one of those hedge funds. And now the liquidators are suing Terra Luna and Terraform Labs for $1.3 billion. Now, my question is, has Terra Luna or Terraform Lab got $1.3 billion? because those that invested into the scam ended up with nothing. And so 3AC is coming after that at the same time as the people that own those tokens wondering whether they have a claim over that. And all of that value was created out of a crash. That meant that 3 Arrows Capital, and who was lending to 3 Arrows Capital? Of course, it was Celsius, it was BlockFi, it was all these different companies, it was Genesis, it was FTX, and that created the contagion of 2022 and the whole crypto centralized market crashing, which create a beautiful buying opportunity for those that actually own their own Bitcoin, while everybody that swapped their real Bitcoin for fake Bitcoin or one of these scams ends up in a mess. But the accusation is that 3AC was misled from Terra Luna in May 2022 in order to overexpose themselves. And they ended up with $462 million worth of Terra Luna in April 2022 that by May 2022, by mid-May, was only worth $2,700, a $500 million wipeout of that balance sheet that had implications on everybody, all of these retail people that were lending, where Celsius was saying things like, we're a bank, we're safer than a bank. They would then pull that money together, lend it to 3AC, who said, I'm only dealing with sophisticated investors. And it turned out that they were on the wrong side of Majinsky, lying to everyone and saying, you should put your entire life savings into this safer than a bank. And for marketing reasons, rather than actually lowering rates and recognizing it was a Ponzi scheme, he would increase rates and go out and tell more and more people and lie to us, which in his defense, he is calling puffery. But what I call a Ponzi scheme and outright fraud will be the allegations, and he'll be defending against them in January 2025. And in the meantime, we're coming after all of his wealth, and we have filed that lawsuit, and including all those that are hiding out in Israel in order to make sure that they don't get their unjust enrichment as a result of creating this Ponzi scheme and lying to people. So everything is intertwined, but now everything is known, and it's beautiful. And we get to see everything and let the process roll out. But as I said, shareholders, we need to make sure we get some activism. So head over, if you are a shareholder in Ionic Digital, to simondixon.com/Ionic Digital. Right, what else happened in the market? So the new TradFi players came along, and because the regulators through the Biden administration didn't put together any good regulators, all these fraudsters were enabled. They ended up defrauding people. And then you have Operation Choke Point 2.0, where you weaponize banking and the ability to own your own money, which is what drives everyone into Bitcoin. And then the TradFi companies come along and say, it's time for us to take over. So you get a bunch of Bitcoin ETFs. And so the grown-ups and traditional players, they get a good regulatory regime where everything's done properly in custody. They make it look like they're good, but it's because the bank lobby pays the different Congress members in order to make sure that regulations is put in their favor, whereas the resistance movement like Bitcoin that comes against it, we all get the shit regulations, and then all the scammers and fraudsters come along and create companies in order to defraud people. But thankfully, there is an exit from the whole thing. Own your own Bitcoin. And that's why there is a fight in order to make sure that Americans and the rest of the world keep their right to own their own Bitcoin, spend their own Bitcoin, and combat the craziness from central banks by combating inflation. So now we've had 9 newly launched US spot Bitcoin ETFs. And they, this week, recorded their first week of positive net inflows. So there's approximately 104.8 million that came in from the week into these ETH ETFs, despite the fact that there was a 23% decline, because as Bitcoin is correcting, as traditional markets are correcting, as bank Ponzi schemes are unwinding between the Bank of Japan and the Federal Reserve, then you go further down the risk cycle, you end up with Ethereum, a proof of stake network, which will likely be the network where all of these, well, the stable coins are all on there, but some will be putting CBDCs on there. So Ethereum had about a 23% decline at the same time as ETH prices, correcting like that, but you still had net inflows into the ETH ETF. So this is proving that the demand for Bitcoin and the demand for Ethereum in those where the traditional financial institutions are allowing them to buy the ETF has got really strong hands. So I've been trying to figure out what the ETF providers would do. But it turns out if they got into these ETFs, they seem to have just as strong hands as the hodler of last resort that owns real Bitcoin. And obviously, this paper Bitcoin is backed by real Bitcoin because of the regulatory regime is granted to these traditional financial institutions, whereas those that didn't have the good regulations, they ended up creating paper Bitcoin and the whole thing blew up, and they ended up creating Ponzi's and all sorts of stuff and unrealistic promises. Okay. So the process started this month. There is inflows. So BlackRock is the largest ETF provider, the BlackRock iShares Ethereum Trust. It had 188.4 million of inflows. And that counted for, over 900 million in approximately 13 days looking at it. The second largest, Fidelity, they had an Ethereum fund that was launched. And that followed with 44.65 of inflows. But remember, we always warned you in Bitcoin Hard Talk that just like what happened with Bitcoin, when you have the grayscale legacy product, because there is no good regulations, you create shitty trusts that charge high fees. And grayscale was the dominator of that market in both Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all sorts of other shitcoins as well. But because they're charging much higher fees as a lower fee Ethereum ETF and Bitcoin ETF come through, you get all this selling pressure out of the grayscale product over to the other ETFs. So Grayscale Trust, they saw a net 180 million outflow as predicted. And this is also contributing to the total amount of outflows, which is about $406.4 million across all of the ETFs. So the natural behavior is paying out and the price action is going exactly as we predicted on Bitcoin Hard Talk as well. Also, the Grayscale Bitcoin GBTC ETF, it continues to decline and have outflows because it's got the higher fee relative to the other. But with only 35% of the original Bitcoin holdings remaining in the Bitcoin ETF right now. So we have drained the swamp of 65% of it. And now it's gone to, an ETF with a good regulatory environment, but it's got higher fees on that. So it's going to other ETFs as well. So where are we now in this essential bad regulations for the crypto companies, good regulations for traditional financial players, so that everyone can be persuaded to take some of their pension, put it in Bitcoin through an ETF, but those resistance against that, hold it in self-custody, so that you can have the freedom that is bestowed upon people. Well, through the ETF, we now have 1,950 traditional funds that have reported owning Bitcoin ETF holdings. And approximately 701 of those funds are holding, they've accumulated for the first time this quarter. So we know that there is increased demand quarter by quarter as more and more of these traditional financial institutions realize that they need to be involved in Bitcoin. And we're getting all of the predatory players that saying originally they wanted to take out the Bitcoin industry and say, no, come on our private blockchain. Bitcoin's a piece of crap. They're now coming over to owning Bitcoin. So we're starting to see these traditional financial players. Goldman Sachs revealed $418 million position in Bitcoin ETF. We also saw that Morgan Stanley has a 187 million position in the BlackRock ETF, while it was selling down its GBTC position because of the higher fee. And we also saw that the Wisconsin Investment Board, they've increased their Bitcoin holding through BlackRock by about $98 million at the same time as selling some of their GBTC. We even saw venture capital get in this industry. DRW Venture Capital, they disclosed a $200 million holding. And that was including 150 million from Grayscale's ETH Trust, which is interesting. That these different players are also seeing that you need some Bitcoin and you need some ETH as well. So what else did we see? Well, there was some further announcement from some of the other corporations in Bitcoin. 4 years ago, This is incredible. There was a tweet from MicroStrategy, Michael Saylor. 4 years ago, MicroStrategy, they started adopting a Bitcoin strategy. So this is the time when everyone's saying it's too late, you missed the boat. They launched their strategy just 4 years ago. At the beginning of the cycle, Bitcoin was correcting. Everyone thought it was over. You get the normal things. The Bitcoin hodlers of last resort, they know that it's a 4-year cycle and you can rely upon the Bitcoin money supply never to change. And MicroStrategy decided to follow a strategy of leveraging their public company to accumulate Bitcoin and leveraging the debt capital markets in order to accumulate more Bitcoin and end up with as much Bitcoin on their balance sheet as possible in order to manage their treasury, because they didn't trust anything else for holding their assets. And ever since they use it as a reserve asset, MicroStrategy, MSTR, the ticker, is outperformed 499 of 500 stocks in the S&P 500. Isn't that incredible? That's the power. And that's why so many other companies are saying, everyone's saying, oh, it's too late, I missed the boat. And that's why you get this really interesting trend of corporations protecting their treasury through Bitcoin as well. Even protecting themselves from short selling. By accumulating Bitcoin, you can wreck the short sellers as well. And that's a really interesting trend that is emerging as well in the treasury management space. So this week, the SEC approves the first leveraged long micro strategy Bitcoin ETF. Now, you are crazy if you want to do that. Now, what happened in Black Monday, as we covered last week? Well, on Black Monday, all of the people that were speculating with paper Bitcoin using derivatives, they all got liquidated. 300,000 liquidations that took their real Bitcoin, exchanged it for paper Bitcoin, leveraged it through a derivative, and ended up being liquidated and losing all their Bitcoin. I don't want that to happen to anybody. And that's why I never use leverage. Use simple principles. Own more Bitcoin each month than the previous month. Never use leverage. And come up with a sound risk management and investment strategy. I'm going to be doing every 4 years after halving. I do my Bitcoin Wealth Builder program for anyone that wants to learn for free how to accumulate Bitcoin wealth. If you head over to simondixon.com and you go to Wealth Building Solutions, you'll see the different solutions I offer. One of them is the Bitcoin Wealth Builder program. You can apply to join that if you'd like to do that this year. We're going to be doing it towards the end of the year. But I don't recommend paper Bitcoin. I don't recommend using all these plays, but people will use it because they like to leverage. Remember, when you leverage, you introduce counterparty risk. You also do exposure to the risks of getting liquidated. And that's what blew up the whole thing. It's always leverage. It's leverage during the dot-com boom and bust. Is leverage during the global 2008 financial crisis. Is leverage during the meltdown of long-term capital management, the smartest guys in the room. Is leverage during the 2022 crypto crypto unwind crisis. Is leverage during the 2023 bank run crisis that blew up Silicon Valley Bank as rates go up in a Ponzi scheme. And is leverage when the Japanese carry trade needs to be unwind and you need to sell off your assets as fast as possible. I like to keep my real Bitcoin where I can control it, where I own it, and have the real promise of freedom to own it, freedom to transact, and freedom to fight the central banks through this resistance movement. So at the same time, the Bitcoin hash rate, which is a measure of the security of Bitcoin, even during these corrections, has recorded its highest rate on Monday. So the hash rate, the security behind the world's largest supercomputer that can't be controlled by any government that secures this network, has got the highest level of electricity and security and hash rate backing it. And it reached that new all-time high on Monday. 627 exahashes per second. That is the world's largest supercomputer distributed around the world, geopolitically distributed so no government can take it down and give us the ability to protect ourselves from the incredible amount of waste of central banks and the proof of weapons network that leads to the death and destruction through funding wars and allowing governments to use the media in order to control and occupy our mind so that intelligence agencies can kill people and massacre people so that we can have our freedom, which, by the way, we protect by begging the Federal Reserve to lower rates so that wealth inequality gets worse, so that we start fighting with each other, so that the world order can change as more and more countries get pissed off with the existing world order. And we have to try and put it all together by creating a peaceful resistance. And you think the electricity behind Bitcoin isn't efficient? Well, guess what? Countries are now using it in order to make their grids and innovation more efficient and move from inefficient electricity to renewable energy to nuclear energy and more interesting forms of energy in this global competitive market that countries and sovereign states will be harnessing. Anyway, at the same time, miner reserves dropped to a low of 1.8 million Bitcoin. That is because they're probably expecting a correction and they need to manage their treasury because they earn Bitcoin, but their expenses and electricity is paid in dollars. So they need to sell some Bitcoin, which is what creates that equilibrium where people that want to buy Bitcoin to protect themselves get to buy it from the miners that need to sell it to cover the electricity in this incredibly free market, efficient market that we are experiencing. So that really indicates that there may be a bit more weakness leading into the first year of the halving cycle and the normal economics prevailing, as I predict and believe it will do, where I put my money where my mouth is. What I did about 4 years ago, by the way, is people always come to me and criticize me and saying, Simon, you were around when Bitcoin was $3. And I said, yeah, but I've been buying Bitcoin ever since. Because I actually believe in it and still buy it every month today, even at these prices. Because where else am I going to put my money? And so what I did in 2020 after the halving, as I said, I'll tell you what, I'll put $1 million in my saving, invest it live, and I'll show you exactly what happens to it over a 4-year cycle. And I'm going to show you that's worth over $10 million. And I'll show you exactly what I did 4 years later. And that was when everyone said, too late, missed the boat. And it doesn't matter whether it's $1 million, $10 million, $100 million, $1 billion, or $10, $1,000. Percentages are the same. Strategy is the same. I'll share that when I go through the Bitcoin Wealth Builder and what I'm doing to build and protect my wealth. And I'll do it again after this cycle. Anyway, make sure you remember at simondixon.com in order to get access to that. But yeah, so, this is the highest hash rate, lowest number of reserves. And this is unfortunately the lowest amount of miner profitability since 2021 because you have the hash rate going up, which makes it harder to mine a Bitcoin, the price correcting. And so that's when you get these distressed companies. Hence why those that have Bitcoin on their balance sheet end up companies like Heart8 trying to get predatory assets. And so we need to make sure that we protect ourselves from that anyway, because the miner profitability is a highly efficient game, And so you need to have your own in-house teams rather than predators saying that they'll construct these types of contracts, which the board fell for. Anyway, BTC, Bitcoin is down approximately 19% from its high. That's just a normal day or normal time period in Bitcoin. And it allows you, when you are a fiat thinker, to buy Bitcoin at a cheaper rate. And with that in mind, rather than being a dollar thinker, when you're a Bitcoin thinker, you get to protect yourself. I'm going to take a quick water break and we're going to go through the macro side. And while I do that, please do me a favor. YouTube doesn't like any of the words that we use in the geopolitical side. So I rely upon you to make sure that we're protecting as many people as possible and following the money, and so that you're prepared for everything that comes next. So do me a favor, retweet, like, put a comment in the comment section. All this helps the algorithm to get more people to find it, and more people to find it, the better. So please do repost right now. I'm just going to take a quick border and then we'll go into the macro section. Okay, did you do it? Right. So what's happening in macro this week? Right. So we had the CPI inflation figures this week. Nothing interesting there. Core CPI, it rose to 0.17. In July, that was published this week. This is completely in line with estimates. Nothing exciting happened in the market. But this just lowered the 12-month rate to approximately 3.2%. That is the lowest rate since May 2021. After that, that led to some hiking. Really, this is all pointing towards that in September, the US is likely, or the Fed rather, the Fed occupies the US. The Fed has managed to get $10 trillion of assets on its balance sheet while it pays a 6% dividends to its banking shareholders, while it gets the world into wealth inequality and takes a constitutional capitalist country into socialism and eventually communism through a central bank digital currency. And it is being resisted against through the creation of Bitcoin. But anyway, they are looked to roll over the Ponzi scheme and do what the market that has assets is begging it to do. Those that hold real estate and those that hold the shares, they're asking and begging for the rate to be cut in September. And this is all pointing towards it. But this causes a slight problem because the Fed has a partnership with its ally, the Bank of Japan. And the Bank of Japan is suffering from inflation and trying to reverse that inflation because everybody's borrowing money from it for free. We covered the Japanese carry trade last week. So this is putting the Bank of Japan in a tight spot, a really tight spot. The world wants it to reduce it back to 0% so people can borrow it for free to buy assets. Bank of Japan wants to control inflation by raising rates to cool down the market. But that created a wave of liquidations, and we still don't know how big that trade is, how much was actually borrowed. And those that borrowed from it, they needed to liquidate assets because they used it in order to hedge their risk and end up with derivatives contracts. We haven't really seen anything yet at the moment. But this is causing worse inflation, and so they may need to increase their rates again. And so if the Fed reduces rates and Japan increases its rates, that causes the issue for those that borrowed money at 0% and bought assets with that money and used leverage and tried to hedge some of that currency risk. This is the reverse of the carry trade. So it's causing it could cause lots of problem. At the same time, America announced that it is in recession. So in order to combat recession, you need a good reason to reduce rates. You don't want to reduce rates in a central planning, with a Terra Luna Ponzi scheme called the Fed. You don't want to reduce rates into a recession because then the market looks at that distastefully. So you need to reduce rates into a good story, which is the Japan carry trade that we have right now. And all meetings will be happening behind the coffers of the central banks that control all of the different markets in what's meant to be free markets. So we're in for a crazy, buckle up your seatbelts. We do not know what's under the hood. There's no blockchain. There's no smart contract. We don't know what kind of collateral is behind that. And so we have to just wait and see. At the same time, China is reversing its policy and moving towards more free markets, which is what we're told is meant to be the non-free market. Now, I know China has a different economic model, but when it's allowing its banks to go bust and it's allowing a deleveraging event and it's allowing for deflation, all of the free market people say, oh, the Fed doesn't like that. The Bank of Japan doesn't like that. And we're the free market. And so they want China to do the same as America, roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme. And so I've not got hope whether China continues that policy, but it's interesting that we're led to believe that the entire economy is wrecked. It's got major debt issues, which it does have some issues. It's got demographic and debt issues. However, it is allowing that to correct. And that's what markets do. You're meant to unwind that, meant to allow companies to go bust. You're meant to have deflation. And that's what markets are meant to do. That was the free invisible hand, which ironically, China is implementing right now and allowing markets to adjust. And so we shall see whether they keep that policy. I don't support any government. Governments will always choose Ponzi schemes, but it's interesting to watch. And so the estimates of what is the Japan carry trade. So you get completely different things. Some say it's only $1 trillion. Others say it's $3 trillion. Others say it's $20 trillion. We got no idea. We don't have transparency. It's not on a blockchain. It's not like Bitcoin where you can see the flows. We got no idea. I'd be surprised based upon just a gut feeling, not much more to it, and speaking with experts and people that I can triangulate my opinion with. I'd be surprised if 50% of the carry trade is unwound. And I think it's big. I reckon it's about 20% max And it could be 5 trillion, 3 trillion, 20 trillion, whatever it is. I mean, I know JP Morgan came out and said 75% of it has been unwound and it's only 1.5 trillion, but I don't believe JP Morgan. And I know that JP Morgan has a massive vested interest in rolling over the Ponzi scheme and obfuscating that from people. So I think 20% is probably a guess. If I get more data, I'll adjust it on Bitcoin Hard Talk and tell you. Remember, the Bank of Japan, they promised that they won't change this right now. So far we have a trust me bro promise from the Bank of Japan saying we won't increase rates. But they're going to have to do a meeting later in order to figure out what they're going to do. If they have more inflation, because that's the knock-on effect, and that's what they were trying to combat in the first place, then by March 2025, they may need to increase rates again. Increasing rates again makes the carry trade worse. The Bank of Japan, if you look at their balance sheet, it owns 80% of the country's ETFs, 50% of the country's bonds. The Bank of Japan occupies the government. It is the lender to the government. It is the owner of all of its stocks. It is the owner of all its ETFs, 70% of its stocks as well. And this is the largest sovereign nation that lends to the US, and people borrow from that money in order to buy US assets in order to prop up the markets as well. And so on the 22nd of August, which I believe is next week, I'm losing track of time, Japan gets its inflation print. And what happens if the inflation print is worse? It's currently about 2.8%. We shall see. We get to watch this in real time next week. If it goes above that, do they need to raise rates? Well, of course they do. But are they going to? It depends on the weapons of mass destruction from the Fed and whether their buddies can say, oh no, you don't get to do that. So we just have moved to central bank economy. This was the inevitable, predictable, and guaranteed result of backing a fiat currency by debt. It takes you off gold. It gets you a bigger government. It gets you more and more war. Why? Because it's a Ponzi scheme where individuals have to get in debt. Banks and financial institutions benefit from the debt of corporations, governments, and then it all ends up on the central bank balance sheet. And when the whole thing implodes, you take away people's freedoms in order to protect their bank deposits. It is one ginormous, massive welfare state. $217 trillion of liabilities through Medicare, through war spending, through interest rates, through Social Security. Where's all that coming from? You can't pay down the economy. And what do we get from our politicians? They're telling us we need to control spending. Elon Musk went on an X Space with Trump, and Trump said, we're going to put you on the board to control and cut spending. Cut spending creates the depression in a Ponzi scheme. That's what causes the crash. That's what causes the deflation and the unwinding. It will never unwind. It can only increase. It can only increase from here. If Fed cuts rates, the carry trade gets worse. It puts it into nuclear. And if Japan increases it goes deeper and deeper into nuclear. And obviously, they'll find a new tool. At what point will the tool be a CBDC? At some point. We've already got Fed now. They're saying we're going to make it illegal, but you've already got one. Now, of course, all these financial institutions, they know about this risk. Everybody will be planning their hedge right now. Where will their hedge come from? More derivatives. That's 1 quadrillion of liabilities and contracts and paper contracts that is larger than the real economy. And who's got the risk on the other side? We don't know. But only the central bank is the one that knows the extent of its situation. We call this markets. This is not free markets. This is occupation by central banking and a Ponzi scheme, and the world's largest regulated Ponzi scheme. And rather than regulating the crypto companies, they allow them to go bust and take billions out of people so that they can give the industry to the traditional financial players that they give some good regulations to. And then what do we do? Obviously, inflation is fudged because how do they fudge inflation? They fudge the CPI numbers by packing illegal immigration into the economy. The central bank's funding all those wars. It creates refugee crisis. And that pits us off against each other because wealth inequality makes us think we're in a war with each other. Good people go to the extreme left, extreme right. And then because of all these wars, or because you have a psyop that wants to inject illegal immigration by keeping borders open, you get to manipulate the inflation figures and make everything look like it's better than it is when everyone's struggling and no one can understand what the hell's going on, because it keeps the reported inflation figures down to manipulate the numbers. And Japan just can't hide its inflation anymore. They can't do illegal immigration because they control their borders. And also, we're all saying that you need to get migration under control, but it turns out that solves the demographic issue. That's the issue that China and Japan have right now. They don't have enough people that want to pay for the aging population that all died after World War II. You got to follow the money, you got to follow the numbers, and then you got to follow the psyops and the media propaganda, and then understand who's truly in charge and what the deep state looks like in order to get and navigate to the other side of this. But fortunately, the world gave us Bitcoin in order to give us the headspace to be able to do this. So the US will try and lower rates in order to appease the market. It's one big Ponzi scheme. It leads to more money printing. And essentially, Japan, through free money at the Bank of Japan, has given everyone free money to buy the world's stocks, to buy the world's bonds. And they can't unwind without crashing the markets and risking deflation. And it will take down the Taiwan market. It will take down the Korea market. It will take down the US market, unless they can find another way of unwinding that, which is where the US likes things like stable coins, where they can take their debt and they can take out the bank out of the middle. That creates issues in the banking system. What was it that Deutsche Bank forecasted? Deutsche Bank forecasted, they forecasted $20 trillion in this trade that is flushing around, that needs to unwind or needs to be redone. That's the same numbers as the 2008 financial crisis in terms of numbers. Whether we get it or not just depends on whether people will buy US bonds. That's it. And you have to sell infinitely more US bonds. And you have to have the shenanigans in the game. And so you have to accept systemic inflation, wealth inequality, and civil unrest. That's the reality of central bank occupation. Remember, though, what is on the bank's balance sheet? Remember, their fractional reserves creating digital currencies and debt-based Ponzi scheme. We saw what happened in 2013 when you raised rates. They need to hold all those assets. And so they got 600 million of bad assets that was lent to them as unrealized losses. And they can't have anything. They have to hold those through to maturity. And so anything that affects the price, the new assets, because they can't sell those in distress, if people need withdrawals, and people need withdrawals because one of these credit issues starts to show itself, and then you end up in repairing the system through a central bank digital currency and just giving up. The Fed took over the whole thing. They own the whole thing. They own everything. And you're paying it through your tax. And probably when the AI takes your job, it will be a universal basic income. We can see where it goes. You have to resist against it, which is why, Harris, what are you doing with America's Bitcoin? You have to create a strategic reserve asset that operates outside the system at the same time, just like El Salvador is buying one Bitcoin every day. Every country needs to do it. It's a national security issue in the end. At the same time, in the geopolitical section, we saw Iran, their whole central bank got hacked. I'm getting ahead of myself anyway. Nobody knows what the credit risk that's built into the systems. Banks need to hold to maturity. The whole thing is, at the mercy of this free money and leverage and derivatives. And so we'll see what happens next year. And remember, on the interview, Elon Musk tells Donald Trump, as I said, that they need to reduce government spending and get more efficiency. You can't unwind the Ponzi scheme. That's the reality. You need a new monetary system on the side, and you need to change the economics. And unfortunately, that normally only happens when civil unrest gets so bad that you have an external war and a world war. And that's why I cover all these things. and make sure that everyone needs to understand how to protect themselves. Did someone forget to tell Elon Musk that the US dollar is a Ponzi scheme? And so if he does figure out how to reduce the budget, it turns out that real economics and real frugility and what works for real business doesn't work with fiat currency. Reducing debt reduces money. As money gets repaid, that crashes the economy, that crashes the banks. Banks have a lower balance sheet. They need to find more assets in order to get their asset ratios in check, and that creates deflation. They lend less more to real estate. People get a correction in real estate, and then people can afford it in the end. And then you get a correction in stock markets, and then maybe you get an exodus into Bitcoin. We'll see. But anyway, the Fed has America and the American government and all the markets under hostage right now. That is what we are. UK is a train wreck. We got our unemployment figures. You don't even want to know what they are. That was a massive increase. And they were already lowering rates in order to roll over the UK GBP proof of weapons Ponzi scheme. And at the same time, the countries that have real resources are the ones that we're waging war on or trying to get allegiances with in order to keep everything alive. So right now, Russia surpassed Saudi Arabia to become China's largest oil supplier. And Saudi Arabia is an American ally, picking which side it is. And then it comes into the BRICS narrative. And that brings us nicely into what happened on the geopolitical side this week. So I'm going to be covering the last step, everything that happened this week in geopolitics, so that then we can work backwards and figure out what we need to do. And then I'll be ending this show until next week. So do me a favor. If you're enjoying the show, please do retweet, please do like, please do share, please do add a comment. It all helps. I'm going to take a quick water and then we'll do geopolitics. Okay, so I covered in previous episodes that retaliation is being expected from Iran. They announced it. They enacted Article 51 in the United Nations. And that led to a series of actions. Iran is still saying that it needs to retaliate alongside the other axes that are located in different areas like Lebanon, like Iraq, like Syria, and like Yemen. And so immediately in reaction to that, the Western allies decide to do some gaslighting. They say, well, you don't need to worry about Israel coming and assassinating people in your country. Please don't retaliate. And so the UK, Germany, and France and the European leaders, they called for a de-escalation. You know how to de-escalate. Stop funding Israel. Allow Saudi Arabia and Iran to normalize. Take out the bases from the Middle East that are used in order to protect the petrodollar, not to create peace in the Middle East. And allow Israel to engage in diplomacy rather than militarizing them to become the next NATO of the Middle East and be the sole nuclear power illegally, so that America can destabilize the region to protect the petrodollar, as it has when it took over from Britain. But it sent a letter to the Middle Eastern countries in order to tell Iran that it shouldn't escalate. And what happened right after that? Well, Iran said, sorry, we're following laws. We're following that we have the right to retaliate. You told everyone you have the right to defend. And so instead, the central bank of Iran gets hacked and has a cybersecurity attack that takes down much of the banking system and causes issues clearing funds. We have seen this before. How many times do we have to see it? Make sure you watch my interview with Elijah if you don't know the trend by now. You have sanctions that causes destabilization in the industry. You then have an ability to get excessive debt through the International Monetary Fund. You then have intelligence agencies that come in and say, we're going to overturn and have regime change. They put a puppet government in, and then they hack the system if you're resisting against it. And then they use terrorism in order to say that when they're funding these different groups, like Netanyahu funded Hamas, like America funded Al-Qaeda and funds ISIS, and then they use them and say, all right, that's the reason why we need to have our war on terror. And so then you get hit with a major cyber attack, and that causes disruptions. And suddenly presidents are falling down from helicopters. The Iranian central bank gets hacked. And at the same time, they're saying Netanyahu comes to Congress and tells everyone, by the way, America, you're going to war with Iran. Guess what the response is? Well, China comes out and says that the assassination of the Hamas peace negotiator, that means that peace talks are over right now. And they're pretending that they're still going on, or they are still going on, but it doesn't ever lead to the fact that Palestine is going to be free. They say that the Gaza ceasefire negotiation process needs to continue. And they have right. It was an invasion of sovereignty and a violation of laws, international law. And the fact that they're doing this, China said, is undermining the ability to have world peace. China says that it is fully supports Iran in protecting its national sovereignty and its security. And then Hamas has reached a point right now where it's just rejecting the negotiations at this point because it doesn't believe Israel is negotiating in good faith. And then the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, they want to put together another round of negotiations, and we go through the same rigmarole. In the meantime, the genocide continues, and more people are being killed, and we get more and more horrific footage. The hostages are not being returned, and we don't get a ceasefire deal because Netanyahu is trying to protect his career. So Iran obviously rejected the joint statement by the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and said that it will need to retaliate. It won't go after civilian targets. And so we have this issue of what's it going to target? Is it going to be infrastructure? Is it going to be military? And what's the impact on the geopolitical side? And what ripple effect will that have? And if you didn't watch my interview on Bitcoin Hard Talk 49, we went through the economic effect, all the financial markets one by one, and how and where this takes us all as well. What else have we got that happened? So, God, the things happen so quickly. There was not the complete escalation, but Hezbollah from Lebanon, there was a series of rockets that got through the Iron Dome. They went to military headquarters of the IDF. It is always the military targets that these go to, rather than massacring children and babies and women. What we're getting on the other side, and so some of those went through, and we're waiting to see what comes next. Now, what came next after this? So Iran says that we need to get revenge. US is saying that we need diplomacy. And in the meantime, it decides that it needs to send over $20 billion in Israel to continue this. What else does it send through? It sends over nuclear powered USS Georgia submarine. Sorry, I'm not a military guy. Just sends all those over to the Middle East. And suddenly we get 40,000 US troops in the Middle East, the most since the Iraqi invasion. That created this humanitarian crisis to replace Saddam Hussein with ISIS, destabilize the region. US still occupies a third of the region and all of its oil. It then uses that oil in order for intelligence agencies to have slush fund, non-congressional money that can execute regime change, military operations, and the destabilization of all of these industries. And now China comes out and says that we need to look at so the quote is, here's the quote from China, by the way. From Ukraine to Afghanistan, from Iraq to Libya, NATO has brought war and distress and disorder to all of these regions and their people. And that's the truth. Say what you want about the CCP. Say what you want about freedom of speech. Say what you want about the human rights violations, which everybody should resist their governments to keep their governments to check. But the reality is nothing compares to the regime change and what has happened in these regions and the refugee crisis that results. And so as a result of that, the Israeli defense minister comes out and he's now even coming after Israel. All of the protesters are coming after the Israeli government. The defense minister comes out and says that Netanyahu's goal of total victory in Gaza is absolute nonsense. He just wants to continue the war and continue the ethnic cleansing. The Pentagon came out and they reacted and saying that they are currently sending 40,000 troops to the US as a result. And now we end up with this other tick for tack where the two different wars in different regions start coming together. Russia has sent across some AN-225 military aircrafts. They've landed in Iran. And they're saying now that whatever the West militarizes Ukraine with in order to expand NATO, Russia will Iran send to Iran as well. And so now the military industrial complex profits are up, their stock prices are up, more and more people are being killed, more and more civilians are being pawned in the middle, and we just got war trying to weaken each other in these proxy locations. Russia has then come out and threatened Ukraine because now NATO and Ukraine is in Russia. So now that needs to be escalated. That all escalated this week. And now it's saying that it needs to respond for some of the strikes that happened in Russia by NATO proxy, Ukraine. And we're seeing all of this. Putin comes out and it says there will be no more peace talks with Ukraine. So peace talks are over. That was meant to be being negotiated as a result of this escalation. It says that the West is, talking about, attacks on civilians, and we get this double standard where when there is attacks on civilians, it doesn't apply if you're an ally. It's called terrorism. And when it happens to the one on your side, the media washes it away and it's propaganda. And these leaders and governments are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger from selling more and more of their oil and pumping more and more of their military industrial complexes on both sides. And the central bank is happy. It gets to pump the people are happy as long as they lower rates, and you get more wealth inequality, as I've covered time and time again. So at some point, we need to figure out how we're going to exit it. And so what's happening now? All right. So Russia has now said, as a result of this escalation, that its navy is to target sites deep inside Europe with its nuclear-capable missiles. So that's now okay to escalate to inside Europe as a result of this. So that leads it to a potential conflict with NATO, which is what the Financial Times are reporting. They get to report the media that is in line with, the lobby groups that want to increase the money flowing around. The German media, what did they report? German media, they reported that their country's chief prosecutor has issued arrest warrants for the Ukrainians that are now being accused of blowing up the Nord Stream gas pipeline. We know that was a US operation. They should have launched an arrest warrant for Biden because Biden blew it up in order to start exporting gas to Europe against Germany's interests, which is meant to be their ally. And now WikiLeaks exposes everything. WikiLeaks confirms and releases all the different documents. And we get to, because it's powered by Bitcoin, it gets to continue. So we get to see everything that's happening, but the vast majority of media just doesn't cover it. And you can see where this is all going. NATO expansion into the Middle East, NATO expansion into Asia, and false flag operation in order to destabilize, in order to justify, while we get crazy policies with open borders that is creating more hate on the left and the right, civil unrest, and everything that was predicted. Okay, so that's the geopolitical situation. And remember what we covered last week, by the way, coming towards the end. I said, look at the pattern that happened in Bangladesh, identical to the pattern that happened in the Arab Spring uprising with the US-funded Muslim Brotherhood. And that creates these revolutions. Well, we saw it in Bangladesh as well. So Muhammad Yunus, and we suddenly get the leaks, the WikiLeaks document that shows that US has been planning this for an awful long time, and the US proxies are occupying, and you have record levels of IMF debt, so you can destabilize the region and pretend that these student protests were just an uprising from people trying to go against their government. And this is no indication of whether I like the existing Bangladeshi government. All governments are far too big, capable of evil, But we see what this regime change does. It exercises the interest of a few at the expense of many, and it is terrorism, quite frankly. And that's what we're seeing. And one final announcement that just came out right now ahead of the BRICS conference, where alternative currencies are trying to be created in order to make a more competitive market and come against the petrodollar, which is the reason why America occupies the Middle East and uses Israel as a proxy to try and make it the sole nuclear power at the expense of many, many casualties and civilian lives. You have BRICS coming along, and they've decided to invite Palestine, which 145 countries recognize, and one country in the world vetoes it being recognized, which is the United States, which is causing this issue in the first place. And so BRICS has now invited Palestine to join BRICS. But remember, you need a resistance against the dollar, against BRICS, and that's where Bitcoin comes in. Make sure you build your Bitcoin strategic reserve asset and build a resistance movement against the occupation from BRICS, which doesn't at this time execute regime changes like the IMF does, but that can change. Everybody needs self-sovereignty. Individuals need to be sovereign with the ability to own their own money, spend their own money, and fight the central banks. So do companies like MicroStrategy and many of the companies that are using it as a strategic reserve treasury. And so do countries. And so make sure you're only voting for the politicians that get it and allow their countries to protect themselves from the occupation from central banks. And I will keep every single week reporting on it to try and get as many people, as many countries, and as many companies to recognize that they need more Bitcoin this month than they had the previous month. They need strategic reserve assets. You need it, your companies need it, and your countries need it, so that we can transition, have a peaceful transition. And at the one point when that central bank digital currency is launched and it's no longer working for us, we get to say there is an alternative and we don't need to blow up the whole thing. We can just naturally have an unwinding of one form to the other. And we have to navigate that together. So always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. It's going to be awful for many. It's going to be great for others. And I want you to be on the right side of the change so that we can do it with peace, love, and unity. And we can expose the tricks and shenanigans so that we, the people, actually get to speak to each other and see the tricks that are being played on us so that we can negotiate our way through this. Peace.